Good afternoon, and welcome to Breaking Free, Creating Transformative Changes in Policing for Minneapolis. This conversation is part of the What's Next series of roundtables hosted by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. My name is Megan Mell, and I'm the Director of Alumni Experiences and College Events at the College of Liberal Arts. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us, whether you are watching live or viewing the recording. To begin, I first want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. This afternoon's conversation is part of a series of roundtables to address the important question of what's next for us to eliminate institutional and systemic racism in society. The series seeks to engage experts from the College of Liberal Arts as well as throughout our community. Our moderator for this afternoon is Professor Michelle Phelps, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology in the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Minnesota. Her research is in the sociology of punishment, focusing in particular on the punitive turn in the US. Her primary lines of ongoing research are on mass probation, criminal justice transformation, and policing. Together with Philip Goodman from the University of Toronto and Joshua Page from the University of Minnesota, Professor Phelps is the author of Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice, which traces the history of US criminal justice reforms from the birth of the penitentiary to contemporary struggles to end mass incarceration. Professor Phelps is currently affiliated with the Minnesota Population Center, Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice, the University of Minnesota Law School, and the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Professor Phelps, thank you for joining us.
Terrific. Thank you so much to Megan and the College of Liberal Arts for sponsoring this series. Thank you to our wonderful panelists who I will introduce in a moment. And thank you to all of you who are attending at home. We really appreciate your interest in the webinar and hope we can share some useful information and a conversation in the roundtable today. So it's my privilege to introduce this group of 4 incredible panelists. I'm mostly going to let folks introduce themselves because I want the audience to get a sense of the speakers and their work in this arena. But briefly, I will introduce folks. We have first Jamael Lundy. He is the committee administrator for the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee at the Minnesota House. Second, we'll have Marquita Stevens. She is the Director of Education Programs and Policy at Urban League Twin Cities. Third, we'll hear from Oluchi Omeoga, who's the co-founder of Black Visions Collective. And last, and certainly not least, we will have Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins from the Minneapolis City Council. So Jamael, if you could spend just a couple of minutes introducing yourself and telling the audience a little bit about your work in this area, that would be terrific.
Sorry, let me get this unmuted very quickly. Hello, my name is Jamael Lundy. As you just heard, I'm the committee administrator for the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee. I'll try to keep my my statements kind of within, and I also work with the NAACP on the Criminal Justice Reform Committee with Dr. Raj. I'll try to keep my statements kind of within the general gist of what members have expressed publicly and with the direction my chair is looking ahead in the upcoming session. The work that the state legislature took on, specifically myself and Chair Mariani, who's the chair of the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee, involved looking at the broader systemic, and I would also say kind of the state level response to the death of George Floyd, but also the ongoing police brutality that we've seen throughout not only the state, but the nation, not only the nation, kind of the world. And we've, in our work, reached out to a whole series of folks. Obviously, we are in continuous communication with the administration who had to respond to kind of the uprisings that followed the death of, the killing of George Floyd. And we also reached out to other academics and professionals to try to craft, and community leaders as well, try to craft a set of bills that we thought could, the criteria that what we were looking for is a set of bills that work together to prevent an incident like this from ever occurring again. For that reason, we put together a package that we call the Minnesota Police Accountability Act. I won't go through the full act, but essentially it had 3 different components, 3 different packages of bills. One did the Reclaiming Community Oversight Act, which really looked at a regulatory compliance and civil litigation. There is the Reforming Accountability Act, which really looked at criminal accountability. And lastly, the Reimagining Public Safety Act, which kind of looked at restructuring larger policy infrastructure of policing and of looking at the kind of the governance model of policing generally. And I think those big acts containing several bills all looked at the problem systemically, and I'd love to kind of discuss it further as we get into the questions. So.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Marquita then.
Good afternoon, everyone, and glad you were here. I'm Marquita Stevens, the Director of Education, Programming, and Policy at the Urban League Twin Cities. My remarks primarily will center around the research that we did in conjunction with the NAACP on a project last year funded by the Leadership Conference. And we looked at the attitudes and perspectives of African Americans primarily in Minneapolis about the Minneapolis police. And we pinned that, and I'll share some of those results with you. My own experience also stems from the role as a facilitator in the conversations between the citizenry of Roseville and the police and city departments right after the Philando Castile murder a few years ago. And that was informed in part by a briefing that I received in Ferguson after the Michael Brown killing as well. So that's the lens through which I'll be speaking today.
Terrific. Thank you. Oluchi?
Hey y'all, my name is Oluchi. I use any pronouns. I think it is important to say that I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm trans, because I am everyone who has come before me. I'm a community organizer. I think it's important when we're talking about conversations around policing and systems change that we bring it to a non-academic level. And I'm bringing my community with me as far as the conversations that I'm going to talk about. I've been organizing for 8 years since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. I really got activated in what was going on in Minneapolis at that time. I also was one of the folks who were integral into the 4th Precinct shutdown in 2015 after the murder of Jamar Clark, and also the occupation of the governor's mansion when Philando Castile was killed. I'm one of the co-founders of Black Visions, which is an organization that's centered and led by Black, queer, and trans Minnesotans, mainly youth, towards the liberation of our people. Yeah, and I totally look better than I do in my photo that everyone loves to use. So just so y'all know, I am a better looking person than in that picture. And I'll pass it on to the next person.
Okay, and with that, if I can hand the mic over to Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And I just gotta state that I think that photo of you, Oluchi, is hot. In fact, I was thinking that before you said that, I'm like, wow, I love the jacket. I like the little hair thing that's kind of sticking out on the side. But so just wanted to claim that. Andrea Jenkins, Minneapolis City Council member, Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council. I use she, her, and her pronouns. I too am Black, trans, queer, and very proud. And so bringing my ancestors to this conversation because they dreamed that we would be in this, in these roles that we occupy in society now. and shaping the ways and the structures that can support Black liberation. And so, you know, right now we are in the midst of a very intense budget conversation around how we reimagine and implement reimagined public safety strategies. But I want to emphasize that you know, we can shift how public safety works in our culture and society, but we also have to shift all the other institutions around how we function in our culture and society. We have to root out the racism that is inherent at the state legislature. We have to root out the racism that is inherent in the philanthropic systems that support the nonprofit industrial complex. We have to root out the racism and the foundations of slavery that underpin institutions like the University of Minnesota and almost every single academic institution in our nation. And so, you know, it took us a long time to get to this place. It can't take 400 years for us to overcome it, but it also is not going to happen overnight. And I think, you know, historically, since African Americans landed on these shores in 1619, we have been building towards a more righteous, more just society. The challenge is that as we have been working towards that Black liberation, there has been obstacles and opposition to that work that has been significant and well-funded and very pernicious in its quest to keep Black and Brown communities oppressed.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for those powerful introductions and for joining us today. So I'd like to start with a series of questions directed towards each panelist and then transition into a broader discussion with the group. And so, Oluchi, I thought I might direct the first conversation to you. You know, as Jamael mentioned in his conversation, in his introduction, you know, we're here obviously because of the police killing of George Floyd and the massive mobilization of community members over the summer and the efforts to reimagine or transform or abolish or defund policing in Minneapolis. And so I thought we might start sort of grounded in that community mobilization, which Black Visions has been such a key part of this summer. And of course, going back many years since the start of the Black Lives Matter movement and the start of all of these groups and coalitions around transforming public safety in Minneapolis that have emerged in the last couple of years. And so I thought what might make sense to sort of ground our conversation in the most recent development of activist demands is around the development of the people's budget. And so I wondered if you might talk a bit about where that idea came from and what it's calling for.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, so the people's budget was really our way of trying to do participatory budgeting in a 6-week time period, which was very hard to do, right? So it's really around like, how are we as the constituents of Minneapolis coming together to talk about what are the budgetary priorities for our city, right? So the people's budget came together with about 4 different listening sessions with over 100 different individuals and organizations that live in, work in, play in Minneapolis to really accumulate and say, let's vision a Minneapolis in which we have the autonomy of deciding where our money goes, right? And where our money goes where it's not killing us. So what are some alternatives that we want to invest in? What are some programs? What is the art that is necessary for us to not just survive, but thrive, for us to be able to put health first, to be able to fund notable alternatives that actually work, right? Because we know that if we actually fund prevention, then we don't have to fund response. And we also know that the police or the Minneapolis Police Department doesn't actually prevent anything. They don't prevent anything, right? So how are we funding prevention and not response? And then the third thing is like, how are we actually understanding that all of these issues that we're having can stem from anti-Black racism, can stem from capitalism, right? Can stem from patriarchy, and how are we actually utilizing and funding economic solutions as well? We are in the middle of a pandemic in which millions of Americans are below the poverty line. They have been before and now they are. We have houseless people. We have encampments all over Minneapolis. So when we take a look and we say, wow, instead of funding housing, we're going to fund what we like to say is public safety, but when we know isn't public safety, that's cognitive dissonance, right? That is not actually equitable. So what the People's Budget was our way of trying to do participatory budgeting on a smaller scale and say, hey, this is actually what the people of Minneapolis want, and this is actually what's going to get us to thrive and not just survive in our society now.
Terrific, thanks. And I really appreciate how concise you are. That was impressive. Terrific. So I was going to turn the mic next to Marquita. And, I had originally thought about this question in terms of what's been happening among North Minneapolis residents over the last couple of months. So there's been some pushback in North Minneapolis to the declaration from the Powderhorn Park event to end the MPD, including a lawsuit from 8 citizens who says that the city is not protecting them adequately. And so I was going to ask, what is your sense from those conversations that you've been having this summer with community about Northsiders' priorities for police reform and policing transformation? And I guess I'll open that up a bit to say, you had also done this earlier research with the NAACP. And so if you want to sort of start there and then kind of walk us through forward, that would be terrific. Marquita, you're still muted.
Thank you for the question. I have to say, though, that as I think about the question, my mind centers on the fact that not much has changed in terms of the residents' perspectives about policing. The same things that were troublesome, in 2019 are troublesome in 2020, which are troublesome in 2010, which were troublesome in 1974. I mean, it's the events of the day have not done much to advance the perspectives about policing on the part of African Americans. Our research says that one of the things that claims the attention in terms of reform is better relationships between police and the community. That hasn't changed. People want better relationships with the police within the community. The other items that are concerned to them is that police receive adequate training and address racial bias. That hasn't changed. People still believe that racial bias within the police force exists and it's directed at them. That hasn't changed. They think about the lack of accountability and transparency on the part of policing and are awaiting the progress and watching the progress of the case against the officers charged in the Floyd murder with bated breath, as they say. So there's nothing much that has changed in terms of the events. It's just another event. And interestingly enough, though, I will add that one of the things that they were concerned about, which is a reflection of the reality that they see this occurring in, and that is mental health services, not only for the public at large that needs them, those individuals among our citizenry that need that, but for the police as well. There was some recognition on the part of the people who participated in the survey and the focus groups that policing is a difficult job and that it is stressful, and that dealing with these very life-threatening in some instances situations on a regular basis can create mental health issues for the police as well. And the concern is as to the extent to which those issues are attended to on the part of the police department. For if it is in fact not attended to on a regular basis, weekly or what have you, then that frustration is maybe the source of their inability to have good relationships with the community at large. They bring that unresolved trauma that they have to the situations that they're facing as well. So there was a recognition, and I think that is the only new thing that we found out of the conversations with people, that there is a recognition of that fact. Nonetheless, it doesn't let them off the hook, that it is something that they have to attend to within their own ranks, within their own structures, such that they are fit to serve the community that they have sworn to protect.
Terrific, thank you very much. So I wanted to turn next to Council Vice President and Andrea Jenkins, and to sort of have you respond to, as we've been talking about already in this conversation, I think, and as we heard a lot last night at the hearing, the community has really different ideas about the path forward with policing, right? And there's calls for defunding the police, there's calls for the Safety for All budget plan to try and transfer some of the funding from MPD to alternative first responders. There's also a call to try and create mobile mental health crisis units. And I just wonder if you could give us kind of your thoughts on where you're at in processing all this. You've been so at the center of these conversations in some ways because of the ward that you represent. And I just wondered sort of if you could speak a little bit on sort of where you're sitting now in terms of how you think about the priorities of what comes next.
Great question, and really just honored to be in this space and listen to my co-panelists as they describe their realities. I took notes on last night's hearing. I have literally about 10 pages. It was interesting. I mean, in some ways we think it's divided, but in many ways, people were all asking for the same things. How do we create public safety in a new reimagined way that keeps everybody safe? But I think the divisiveness is reflected in the fact that people have differing ideas on how we get there. I was really kind of struck by the comments from Marquita, and actually not struck in any way at all, because I am Black. I live and breathe in Black community space and talk to Black people on a very regular basis. But I was just surprised by, some of the remarks, in that people didn't say, we don't want police. They said, we want police to be accountable. We want police to be relatable. We want police to understand that they play a role in our community, just like the bus drivers, just like the butcher shop, just like the post office, just like the social services that people rely on. They play a role in our community. I think the challenge is that the police department in Minneapolis and every place else in this country I mean, Minneapolis is not an aberration. The police are militaristic and in every community in this country. You know, sans white communities, where it does appear that the police are very capable of being an integral community member and part of those communities. It is not evident that they have that same level of relationship and commitment to being in community in Black spaces and Black communities. And so I was just really, really struck by that. But I know that to be true. You know, I talk to my mom, I talk to my aunts, I talk to my cousins, I talk to my friends who live in various communities all throughout the country, and certainly here in Minneapolis, and Black people are saying, for the most part, we need police. We need them to be accountable. We need them to be professional, and we need them to be active and committed members of our society. You know, last night's public hearing was emotional. It was very passionate. It was very well organized. I mean, certainly we heard from a number of people from supporting the police, the people's budget, and then subsequently the Safety for All proposal that has been submitted and forwarded by council members Cunningham, Bender, and Fletcher. And there was a considerable amount for supporting the mayor's budget. I fall somewhere in between that space and really want to and will be supporting the Safety for All plan that, you know, everybody, I believe, wants to see a mental health response, a co-responder scenario that addresses and responds to mental health crises, to really shift some of the professionals from the Minneapolis Police Department to other agencies within the city, including the Office of Violence Prevention, and funding that support. And I will say that we have been on this path. I mean, this is not new. It certainly has been, I think, accelerated with the murder of George Floyd, which, by the way, you kind of alluded to, Michelle, but if folks don't know, I am the 8th Ward City Council member, and the intersection of 38th and Chicago sits almost squarely in the middle of my ward. And so we were and are still deeply impacted by the murder of George Floyd, and we're reminded of it every day because we have a quote, autonomous zone that is disrupting the flow and the movement of people through out the ward and impacting the city, quite frankly. So deeply challenged by these issues. You know, I will state that I am an abolitionist. I believe that we must rid our society of prisons. But when I think about how that manifests itself, I know that there are some people, and this has been true throughout the history of human society, that are not able to fully participate in societal life for a variety of factors and reasons. And we have to help those people to become those kinds of contributing members to society. But sometimes people have to be pulled out of society to have that happen. And so what if prisons became colleges? And right now they are colleges. They are colleges on how to become a better criminal. But there have been examples throughout the world, and particularly in Germany, in Russia, where prisons are compounds that people can walk about freely, can go to school, can have jobs that pay real wages, not slave labor, so that they can continue to support their families and be connected to their families. And they don't call them prisons. That is where we need to be moving to in our society. And the same with abolishing the police. We need to be supporting structures that will make crime and violence less of a reality in our communities. However, that work is going to take time, and we still will need to subsequently remove people from society that can't abide by those rules. If we want to have a society that is governed by laws and rules, then somebody has to enforce those laws. Otherwise, we are just living in quote, I guess, anarchy. People are, we need people to be a part of this social contract that says we are going to respect and love each other, which is a word that I just struggled to say, and that is at the core, I think, of how we are going to move forward. But I heard a lot last night, and even this morning, Oluchi said police they only respond to crime. Yes, but people need that response. If somebody gets murdered, I need somebody to go and investigate and hold the people who murdered my family member accountable. Police do that. Police do, I think, personally, prevent crimes. When, one example was last night that I will share again today. When you're driving down the freeway and you see the state trooper, you slow down. You don't drive 95 miles an hour past the state trooper. So police do deter crime. Is it enough of the deterrence? Clearly not. Which that's the argument of I'm sorry, my brain, I'm so overtired, you guys, but the death penalty is supposed to be a deterrent, right? But it really is, as I think I've heard either last night or this morning, some maybe, Michelle, you said it, violence begets violence. I am adamantly opposed to the death penalty. I don't think the state has a right to kill anyone, whether it's judiciously or extrajudiciously, and those who do it should be completely held accountable. But we have to be a nation of laws, and we have to enforce those laws. People say crime is only created because of poverty. I beg to differ. We have a White House full of criminals, and those people are rich as hell, and they are breaking the laws and creating violence, economic violence, putting kids in cages every single day. That's crime, and those people are not poor or need to have activities for their kids. People create crime. It's a reality, and I'm not sure how we change that, but okay, that's enough. Usai.
I just want to say something.
I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I'm feeling right now.
Oluchi, I could tell throughout that you're jumping to Diane, but we have one more question for Jamael, and then another question that gets exactly to this issue of like, how else do we support community members and how do we think about alternative responses to preventing harm? And so is it all right if I put you just on pause?
It's fine, low-key, I have ADHD. I will probably forget what I was gonna say, but it's okay, it's okay, it's okay.
Okay, I promise you get to be the first responder to that next question. So Jamael, I wanted to give you a chance to jump into the conversation. And the reason we invited you onto the panel was Minneapolis, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Minneapolis is embedded in a state context and of course in a national context as well. And I think some of the conversation that gets missed around the question of transforming policing is how much cities can actually accomplish, right? And how they're constrained by both state and federal policy and potentially, right, with the right kinds of leaders enabled by state policy and enabled by federal policy. And so I just wanted to give you a minute to talk a little bit about how you see the role of state policy setting what cities like Minneapolis can do and what you think should happen at the state level to sort of push this issue forward.
All right. I wrote a few notes on kind of the approach the legislature took and why it took that approach. I do think the state plays a very important role, as obviously we license all local police offices, and then we create rules and obviously statute that govern the behavior of police officers and actually restrain them in many instances, but also empower them in many instances to do both negative and positive things. A part of our legislative response to the death of George Floyd actually started well before the death of George Floyd. One of the issues Chair Mariani and I identified when the chair was first issued this committee assignment and I was brought on as committee administrator was police brutality. And it was actually an issue area where we had very little help. And so we spent the better part of a year and a half before George Floyd occurred. And Michelle, you were one of the people we met with, and kind of exploring what the academic literature said. We reviewed all the reports put forth by the state of Minnesota and other academic institutions. We looked at the NAACP report issued with the help of the Urban League. We also looked at Michelle Gross, the Community United Against Police Brutality, put forth a report. We looked at the old governor report following Philando Castile. We reviewed, upon your advice, Michelle, kind of the conflicting reports put forth by the different subsects and committees from that governor's task force. And what we found was essentially, especially after reviewing a lot of the, after George Floyd occurred, is we found that Minneapolis had a lot of the proposals in place that a lot of folks were suggesting. So they had the chokehold ban, the duty to intervene. There are a lot of policy proposals that Minneapolis, and on a policy level that is supposed to be enforced by the chief law enforcement officer, is actually, compared to many of the other smaller localities, kind of ahead of the curve. And yet, because of this, for many reasons, we still had negative outcomes. And so what we at the state level recognize that it is, part of this came on a lot of our discussions around these bills, where that it is the state's role is to ensure that every citizen's human rights are always preserved. And that is the proper relationship it should have when it comes to police accountability, is looking to ensure that, yes, there are a lot of discipline matters and labor matters that are of the local purview. When it comes to human rights, it is a state responsibility, and it's technically everyone's responsibility to ensure everyone's human rights are protected. And so for that reason, when it came time to interface with the Senate, which is a GOP-controlled entity, we felt the emphasis from the Senate on what I kind of think of as Clio Enforcement, and Clio's a acronym for Chief Law Enforcement Officer. They had a series of bills, over 5 bills, that were basically all relied on the chief being told to do certain things. So the chief of police would be told, no more chokeholds. You now have a model policy put into place that you must ensure that folks don't have a chokehold. They make sure that they report any law enforcement malfeasance, so there's a duty to intervene. And we found that none of these had state teeth. It had no teeth where the state, if they see somebody violating this model policy, that the state would be able to step in and issue some type of action on an individual law enforcement's license. And without that ability to protect human rights through licensure, and you're just using policy and union arbitration to enforce discipline, that there's a different level of accountability that comes from an independent entity with authority. And so what we endeavor to do is to create, if you're looking to solve a systemic problems, oftentimes you create an institution or a system to combat that systemic problem. And the issue we're looking at here is systemic state violence, and particularly systemic racism. And what we were looking to do is create systems within the existing institutions or infrastructures. We're not reinventing the wheel. But part of that is for political reasons, because it's more difficult to build a new institution than to augment an existing one. You encounter more resistance, and it's actually more expensive too on top of it. For those reasons, what we endeavored to do was look for different ways. For instance, that I can go through quickly. There are 3 acts, and I'll highlight 3 really quick bills within each one. So the Reclaiming Community Oversight Act, there are several bills in them. 3 of the big ones are retroactively repealing the statutes of limitations that allows for individuals who are victims of police in order to sue folks in the future, or to sue folks who've harmed them in the past. So currently there's a statute of limitations, and the police can run out that clock because it can't begin to tick until the investigation is done. They uniquely have power over the investigation. Secondly is, and I'll wrap this up very quickly, a Law Enforcement Oversight Council reform. What we've noticed is local law enforcement oversight, particularly even if you have a really great commissioner who's in charge of it, those citizen oversight councils are legislatively prohibited from doing investigations, from providing being authorized to provide discipline recommendations themselves, and from having subpoena power to ensure that they have access to all the records. And most of that is brought forth by statutes. And then lastly is data collection regulatory reform. We passed portions of this, but essentially the state of Minnesota, the public doesn't have a dashboard to look through individual police police departments' discipline records. We have no way to compare apples to apples. We only have a sheet of paper that's statutorily mandated every year that each department issues to the post board. And up until this year, the post board didn't publicly even publish that one sheet of paper. And so there's a number of systemic issues when it comes to accountability that the state put in place. And then lastly, I'm just going to very quickly run through, and I don't want to spend time on the actual legislation. I do want to talk about it on a more higher level. The state policies limits that kind of restrain the ability of locals to act. And then some of the changes that are coming in state policy that hopefully gives us the ability to start moving that. And so I'll run through it very quickly. I wrote it down in a note. We have disempowered local community oversight boards. That is by statutes. We have atrophied law enforcement innovation. There is no state level investment. There is no one out there looking to find a disruptive way of hunting down stolen items. There's no new programs for looking at There isn't at a state level a high level of investment in innovative law enforcement techniques that could provide different types of crime prevention that doesn't necessarily flow from police. There was a captured regulatory body. The Post Board hasn't issued a single police accountability regulation in its entire history that was not brought on by a state legislature. Like the state legislature had to tell them to do anything involving, that's not the way a regulatory board should function. They should look for different ways to rein in what they're tracking and seeing as oversteps, especially if you have kind of a global uprising that comes. And then what else? The complaint record statutes prevents sharing complaint records freely. The discipline process statute gives even, now it's too much power to arbitrators and local folks when it comes to violations of human rights. There's a police versus public safety subsidy. So we subsidize police work in a way that we really don't subsidize public safety work. We don't look at the holistically what creates a community safe. For instance, like those mental health response teams, community violence interrupters, domestic violence shelters, and we don't look to systemically fund those in the way that we give LGA out and help out local law enforcement. Then lastly, the cost of reform, which is the dirty thing folks don't like to talk about, is it costs money to do things like decriminalize even CBD. It's costing over $1 million to our budget to make something not enforced by law enforcement. And eliminate, largely unpaid fines and fees. And a lot of these efforts that would eventually reduce the prison population require an upfront investment, which makes it expensive and difficult to do when you have to settle a state budget. So, and this my last point is three quick solutions or bright spots to overcome some of these systemic barriers. Regulatory reawakening is helping. At the Post Board, the governor has appointed folks who are finally been seated a majority of governor's appointees who are reform-minded folks. Now, obviously, the Post Board is still propagated by largely law enforcement. However, at least they're law enforcement with an open mind to reform efforts. And there's a lot more community engagement in the Post Board. Some of the appointments are, for instance, my friend Dr. Raj, who now sits on the Post Board, who will hopefully be a new voice there to help enliven this atrophied regulatory body. Statutory reform, creating a citizens council and Post Board. So now we have a body within the Post Board dominated by citizens, which individuals like, for instance, cities like Minneapolis can bring legislation to and have that body voted to the final Post Board, the actual board members, and they have to vote it up or down. So it's not just a citizens council that has only the power to issue reports. They can put something on the agenda of the Post Board proper and make them vote on something that could have a lot of effects on local Minneapolis. And lastly, legislative prioritization. That's a new development. When we first started working on police brutality, we couldn't get anyone to listen. We couldn't get, our bills were like the one bill every year we knew we were going to get beat up on were the police brutality bill. Cops would come in and laugh us out. I know, Michelle, you probably followed some of our work. So you know that we weren't taken very seriously. People would literally say, we're like, hey, there's a crisis of confidence in law enforcement. And they would say, no one believes that. No one doubts law enforcement. And then we had to go and meet with the same folks after a global uprising around the lack of confidence in law enforcement. And so now that folks have seen that and reawakened that, the leadership, at least the governor's office and the Minnesota House, have highly prioritized this issue. And even the Senate, I'm somewhat hopeful that that the Majority Leader Gazelka has some political impetus to at least appear as though he would like to work on this issue. So I know, right? I'm seeing a lot of folks who are doubting it. I'm hopeful that the appearance of not looking like you could care less about the plight of people of color is enough of a impetus for him to at least act on something. But I'm holding my breath.
They could care less that we think they care less.
Hey, Councilwoman, Vice President Councilwoman Jenkins, I firmly would not disagree with that assessment. But I'm hopeful.
I was going to say the record is not great on that one, but we can all hold our breaths. Well, thank you very much, Jamael. I appreciate it. That was terrific. So I'm conscious that we're running a bit late on time. What I was going to transition next to was a question about, this concern about community members and crime and victimization has obviously dominated the front page of local newspapers over the last couple of weeks. And I think that conversation often gets reduced into this conversation of like, do we have enough police or do we have not enough police for the problem of crime, and less about, how is the pandemic increasing economic instability that prompts crime? How is the closure of schools and community centers and all kinds of opportunities for youth creating crime? How are empty businesses and empty streets creating opportunities for victimization? And so I wanted to give everybody a chance to kind of weigh in on sort of public safety beyond policing, but we're a little short on time. So I think what we'll do instead is I'll turn the floor to Oluchi, who I promised to come back to. I will honor that promise. And then I want to end with just a really quick one sentence from all of the panelists. Something that audience members said in a lot of their comments to the panel was, what can I do? And so if you just have, everybody has one sentence to conclude with, we'll start with Oluchi after your comments, with what you would leave panel members or audience members with, sort of what are the next steps for them and how can they get engaged in this work?
Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet. So first of all, low-key, I'm actually asking for no police, but that's another, me and Andrea can talk about that in a later time. So I think that there's a difference between deterrence and prevention, right? When we look at deterrence inhibits the likelihood of something will happen, right? It doesn't actually prevent it from happening, which is what prevention is. So even in the example of the speeding example, right? Just because you see a cop car on the side of a road, it might deter you from making that behavior, but it doesn't actually change you from making that behavior in the future. You're just gonna be sneakier about how you make that behavior, right? And that's the same thing with policing. So when we look at, for example, folks who sell drugs because it's an act of poverty, right? They don't stop selling drugs because they get caught. They just find other ways of selling drugs so they don't get caught, right? So it's like, and then also when we talk about crime, so I think something that you said that really stood out to me, Andrea, was like, crime is like, just because someone is in poverty doesn't mean that they'll commit crime, or crime is not an act of poverty, right? But low-key, Jeff Bezos is one of the biggest criminals in all of our existences, right? He is going to be a trillionaire in about 10 years, right? He is a criminal because he profits off of slave labor, because he fires people in the middle of a pandemic, because he does not care about the people that work for him, yet the things that he does are not called crimes. But if I, who is someone who's living under the poverty line, were to go steal a TV from Walmart because I need that in order to sustain for my family, then that's automatically a crime. So when we say crime, we have to actually say what we're talking about. And when we say crime, it's like crimes profit off of capitalism. So even your example of when Donald Trump locks away children, contributes to the prison industrial complex, that actually sustains capitalism, right? So he might not be poor, but he is getting other people richer. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about crime, right? So I think those are two important points. I think the last point that Jamael, you talked about was like the cost of decriminalization, right? And like even CBD is gonna cost us $1 million to decriminalize or whatever, legitimize. But what you're not seeing is like, even when we take a look at the decriminalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington, which were the first two states to do that, and you look at their economies years after, their economies boomed because of that. But who was making the money? It was white affluent people, not the Black and brown people who were criminalized for that same drug before. So those are just a couple of things that I wanted to say before I left. So I apologize.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's go. Marquita, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you want to give the audience your last thought?
I guess I would anchor my philosophy in a sense of full citizenship. Black folk are looking for full citizenship. And so we're looking for laws to come out of the state that will allow us to live freely and in good intention. And that the laws governing policing, to me, need to start with a redefinition of the role of policing. We need a constitutional amendment or some such thing that will redefine policing and shift it from that which is created to protect property to that which is created to protect people. We haven't had a redefinition of policing since it existed, since it began. And we need to do that if we are going to expect the behavior and the actions of police to be any different. How I define you is in large part how you're going to behave. And so until we take that step, we're just tinkering. And we're at a point now where our citizenship is at risk. And so we can't afford to tinker any longer. And so I would say that the next steps would be to, in honor of the question you asked us to address at the end, what to do next, need to advocate around full citizenship for everybody, including Black folk. This division will then stop or at least be addressed as a result of anchoring what we do in any way that will advance full citizenship for everybody in the community, Black folks included.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, Jamael, you've got 60 seconds, and then I'll let Council Vice President Jenkins have the final word.
Okay, for 60 seconds. The big thought I like to leave folks with is thinking about, and I'm going to use this sexist term advisedly, which is think about policing using a guys with guns model, because it's mostly guys. But when you think about police reform, I often advise folks to use this model to help think about a state use of force. And ask themselves, does a state agent who does a specific function need force to accomplish that function? That is, so if we find out meter maid, folks who write tickets for you for parking, they're a state agent who tries to patrol crime, but they don't need force to do that function. And there's a number of functions police carry out that they don't need force to do. So why are we overburdening an institution that should be is best at? We would like to think they're best at, and they're specifically charged as agents of the government who are authorized to use force. We should streamline that, which is why I like to use the phrase modernizing public safety versus abolishing the police. Both can actually, in a policy space, end up with the exact same policy, but they take different approaches to get there without presuming that you need to lower the amount of police or money to accomplish specific public safety aim, even though oftentimes you probably do, or probably can. And then the one thing folks can do, I just cannot stress enough, post board. I tend to think that we can, the same ways we've regulated a lot of industries and a lot of actions from individual citizens, in many ways police overregulate some communities. I think police can be regulated into respecting human rights, but it takes a lot of authority, change in governance, and independence invested within that authority in order to rein them in. But that is a vision I hope to see actually carried out in the state of Minnesota. So. Oh, and Black, sorry, you can write a comment in the post board for some upcoming rules that they're having. You can approach the Citizens Oversight Council on the post board, which is a group of citizens who can put police regulatory changes into a vote at the post board and actually change policy. So again, you have citizens at the post board right now, Representative Herr being one of them, who can inform police policy, and they have a whole bunch of power. So I would steer everybody who's watching that to contact someone they know, like Dave Hutch, who serves on the post board if they have an issue with Minneapolis, and specifically if a governance issue with Minneapolis.
Thank you very much. And Madam Vice President, I'd like to give you the final concluding thought for our audience.
Absolutely, I will try to keep it to the request of one sentence. Become an anti-racist. Check your anti-Blackness. And I know I have to work on being an anti-racist every day, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic. I have to work on that every single day. And so I think everybody has to and should. And if that occurs, we can end many of the social ills that are impacting and that are negatively impacting our communities today.
Terrific, thank you. Well, with that, I will say thank you to our audience and turn things over to Megan, who will close the program.
Thank you, Professor Phelps, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today and bringing their perspectives to this important conversation. I hope we can invite you all back for a follow-up, as I know there's a lot more to say on this topic. To everyone watching online, thank you for taking time this afternoon to participate in the roundtable. This event has been brought to you by the College of Liberal Arts, where we are reimagining the 21st century liberal arts experience as a diverse, energetic community of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and donors. We seek to make a difference at home and throughout the world. Together, we are shattering expectations of what a liberal arts college can be. This is our final roundtable for 2020, but stay tuned as we have more in the works for after the first of the year. More information about the What's Next series can be found on the College of Liberal Arts website. I hope you will join us all again in the future. Until then, stay well and have a great afternoon.